Hi everyone. In this lesson, we have to learn the concept of leverage or solvency ratio. This is an important classification of ratio based on the functions and nature of ratio. We know that the ratio analysis or the ratios are the tools or techniques used for analyzing the financial statement of the firm. By using the different kinds of ratio, a businessman, they can analyze their financial statement and they have to ensure or they can understand the financial position and the financial viability of the concern. Throughout the lessons, we have to learn the concept of solvency ratio and its classifications. The term solvency refers to the ability of a firm to pay its outsider liability, both long-term and short-term liabilities. Simply, the leverage or solvency ratios are those ratios which is used to measure the long-term liquidity position of the company. So we can say solvency ratios are used to analyze the long-term financial position of a firm. Also, it helps to analyze the capital structure of the firm. Capital structure is the combination of equity and the debt that is put into used by the company in order to finance their operations. So we can say that the capital structure is a combination of debt and equity. By combining the different sources of capital they have for framing their capital or for framing their financial source, a company can issue the debenture or they can issue preference shares, equity shares. These are the different sources of finance. By using or by combining this source, a company can frame their capital. This is the concept of capital structure. Simply, this means a combination of debt and equity for framing their capital. By using the solvency or the leverage ratio, a businessman can analyze their capital structure and their leverage position of the company. They have to analyze how much the fund should be invested in the owned capital and how much to be invested in the debt capital. What is the proportion of contribution of these all the sources of capital for framing their capital structure. Okay, listen. There are two classifications under the leverage or solvency ratio: structural classification or the structural ratio and the coverage classification or the coverage ratio. Basically, the leverage or solvency ratios are classified into two: structural and coverage. The structural ratio, it indicates long-term solvency of the firm. It measures the extent of debt financing in a firm. Also, it is based on the relationship between owned and borrowed capital. The structural ratios are used to calculate from the balance sheet items. There are number of structural ratios are there. First one is debt equity ratio, second one is total asset to debt ratio, then proprietary ratio and the solvency ratio. These are the different ratios available for analyzing the long-term financial position of the company. It is under the structural ratio classification. And also next classification is coverage ratio. Coverage ratios are those ratio which is used to ascertain the firm's capacity to pay This ratio is used to ascertain the firm's capacity to pay the interest and dividend regularly. Also, it helps to analyze the profitability of the firm. By using the profit and loss items, we have to measure the coverage ratios. There are two types of coverage ratios are there: interest coverage ratios and dividend coverage ratios. Okay, in this lesson we have to look the debt equity ratio. This is one of the structural ratio in detail. Debt equity ratio is used to test the solvency of the firm, solvency position of the firm. Also, it helps or it indicates the relative proportion of debt and equity in financing the assets of the firm. We know that the company finance their assets. It may be fixed or short-term assets or current assets. They are financing their assets by using this long-term funds. Okay. By using debt equity ratio, we have to analyze the relative proportion of debt and equity used for financing their assets. Okay, it is also known as external internal ratio or security ratios. The debt equity ratio is further named as external internal ratio or the security ratio. The standard or ideal ratio is 1:1. This means the fund provided by the outsiders and the shareholders must be equal. Some experts suggested that 2:1 as a standard ratio, but the entire public sector companies, they are accepting 1:1 as an ideal. There are two types of debt equity ratios are there. By the name itself, it indicate the formula. We can remember this formula of debt equity ratio very easily. We know there is two term debt equity. The formula is debt by equity. For calculating the debt equity ratio, the formula is debt by equity. The name itself, we can identify the formula. Okay, there are two types of debt equity ratio. First one is long term debt equity ratio and second one is total debt equity ratio. The long term debt equity ratio, which calculated by using this formula, long term debt divided by equity or shareholders fund. From this equation or formula, we can see that there is two terms or there are two components are there, that is long-term debt and shareholders fund or equity. The long-term debts includes debenture, mortgage, all long-term loans. Okay, the long-term debts, this is a first component, long-term debt divided by equity. This is a formula for long-term debt equity ratio. From this formula, we can see there is a component long-term debt. The long-term debt should be calculated by adding debenture, mortgage and all long-term loans. Also, next component is equity. Equity is the term of equity, the amount or the component value should be calculated by adding equity capital, preference capital and all the reserves and surplus. We know that these are the funds available for the equity shareholders. So we can say it is a shareholders fund. Okay, or it also, there is another term, net worth. Net worth is a total funds for the equity shareholders excluded the external liabilities, that is a fictitious liabilities like preliminary expenses, etc. We can calculate the net worth by deducting the shareholders fund. From the shareholders fund, we have to deduct the prepaid expenses, then we get the net worth, the amount of net worth. Okay, then next debt equity ratio classification is total debt equity ratio. It should be calculated by using the formula total debt divided by equity or shareholders fund. Here we have to identify one difference from above definition or above formula. In this formula, we have to divide the equity by total debt. We have to divide the element of total debt with equity. Total debt in the sense it include all the long-term liabilities or debt plus current liabilities. The components, there are two components are there. For by looking the formula, you can identify two components, total debt and equity. Total debt should be calculated by adding long-term debt plus current liabilities. Also the equity portion We know that we already discussed the equity portion. It is a shareholders fund. That's by adding equity capital, preference share capital, and all the reserves and surplus. Okay, these are the basic and most important formula used for calculating debt equity ratio. There are two types of ratio: long term debt equity and total debt equity. Long term debt equity should be calculated by using this formula, long term debt divided by equity. Also, total debt equity ratio should be it should be calculated by using this formula, total debt divided by equity. Okay, these are the basic two tools or two classification of debt equity ratio. Thank you.